Hello, everyone. Welcome to this space where we explore the quieter corners of human behavior and the thoughts we usually avoid speaking out loud. Today, we're reflecting on something deeply personal yet widely experienced: the subtle shift between connection and emotional exhaustion, and what it really means when presence starts feeling heavier than absence. Most people assume disappearing is dramatic, but what if the real weight lies in staying visible to people who slowly drain your energy without even realizing it? There comes a point in some lives, after years of constant interaction, when things start to feel different. You no longer feel truly understood by those around you. Conversations begin to repeat themselves, laughter loses its natural flow, and even simple notifications can start to feel overwhelming instead of comforting. Without fully understanding why, a person begins to crave space rather than attention. Over time, the version of a person that was created for social survival becomes so dominant that the authentic self gets buried underneath it. Life turns into a series of responses, explanations, and performances designed to maintain connection, even when those connections no longer feel emotionally alive. Many continue to stay available not because they want to, but because silence feels unfamiliar, even threatening. Yet silence has a way of revealing uncomfortable truths. It exposes which relationships were dependent entirely on your availability. It shows how many people were only comfortable with you when they had uninterrupted access to your attention. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals how much of your identity was shaped around being accepted rather than being genuine. Most people never realize how much they have adjusted themselves until they step away. And when they do, something unsettling often happens. The reactions from others begin to change. Some people become distant, some become irritated, and others suddenly show renewed interest. Not necessarily because of genuine emotional depth, but because the absence disrupts a pattern they had grown used to. Predictability makes people comfortable. It allows relationships to run on assumption rather than awareness. This is why constant accessibility is often unconsciously encouraged in social life. When someone is always available, they become easier to understand, easier to expect, and easier to emotionally position. But when that availability disappears, even briefly, uncertainty enters the space. And uncertainty is something many people struggle to tolerate. From a psychological lens, isolation is not always about loneliness. Sometimes it is a form of mental clarity, a withdrawal from roles that were unconsciously performed for acceptance. Over time, people can lose track of where their real personality ends and where their adaptive self begins. They begin to live in ways that avoid rejection rather than reflect truth. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how unnoticed this process can be. Years may pass while someone slowly builds a version of themselves designed to stay safe, liked, and included. But in doing so, they may drift further away from their inner sense of self. When silence finally arrives, it doesn't just remove noise from the outside world. It also reveals what was being ignored inside. Around others, you become quieter. Over time, you no longer recognize which version of yourself is real, only which version keeps others comfortable. And that's where something unsettling begins. Isolation stops being just loneliness and starts feeling like psychological exposure. Because when the noise fades, there is no audience left to perform for, and without an audience, the version of you built for survival starts to weaken. This is usually the point where people rush back into distraction. Back to messages, back to casual conversations that don't mean much, back to constant stimulation that fills the space silence creates. Because in the beginning, silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like confrontation. It forces awareness of things that were easier to ignore when life was loud. You begin noticing patterns that were always there but never fully visible. Certain people only reached out when they needed emotional comfort. Some friendships were quietly built on shared emptiness, not genuine understanding. And there are moments where you realize how often your own boundaries were softened just to avoid disappointing others or creating distance. Kindness without boundaries, over time, starts to blur into self-erasure, not because people are intentionally harmful, but because access changes behavior. When someone is always available to listen, others naturally begin to rely on that availability. When forgiveness is always given, limits begin to disappear. When someone never leaves, others slowly stop considering what leaving even means. And this is where silence becomes powerful in a way most people don't expect. Your absence begins to create discomfort in places your presence used to quietly manage. Not because your disappearance is dramatic, but because it interrupts emotional predictability. Some people don't respond to anger the way they respond to distance. Anger still keeps you emotionally present in their world. Silence removes that presence completely. And when silence enters, uncertainty follows. People begin to question what changed, whether something went wrong, whether you are upset, whether you are slowly pulling away. But beneath those surface thoughts, there is often a deeper discomfort they cannot easily name. The realization that your life does not revolve around their access to you. A lot of people confuse closeness with constant availability. They believe frequent communication means emotional depth, that immediate replies equal care, that uninterrupted access equals loyalty. But real connection is not always measured through frequency. Some of the strongest bonds exist quietly, without performance, without constant reassurance, without the pressure of maintaining emotional visibility. When distance enters, clarity often follows. It becomes easier to see which relationships were built on genuine understanding and which ones depended on habit, routine, or emotional convenience. The mind starts observing differently. Not just what people say, but how they react when your availability changes. At times, there is also a quiet shift in how people respond to you. Not always openly, but in subtle changes. Slight emotional withdrawal, delayed responses, a colder tone, or indirect remarks that carry more feeling than words suggest. Human behavior is sensitive to changes in access and control, even when it is not consciously acknowledged. When someone becomes less reachable, less explainable, and less predictable, others often begin to feel that shift internally, especially those who had grown used to emotional consistency from you. And that is why stepping back can change dynamics faster than any explanation ever could. Because what many people struggle with is not growth in others, but loss of control over access to them. And once you start seeing that clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee. Sometimes it becomes clear that the people around you never really knew you. They only knew the version of you that stayed constantly available, the one that tolerated too much, the one that chose peace on the outside even when it cost peace on the inside. And when that version begins to fade, relationships often start to feel unstable. Not always because something new is happening, but because many social bonds are quietly built on roles rather than authenticity. One person becomes the listener, another the entertainer, another the emotional support system. And when someone steps out of that unspoken role, it can create discomfort, even resentment, as if individuality itself is disrupting the balance people got used to. Many relationships don't actually end when respect is lost. They begin to change when awareness arrives. Because awareness alters tolerance. You stop normalizing emotional imbalance. You stop justifying behavior that repeatedly costs your inner peace. You stop chasing connections that only feel valuable when you are easily accessible. And in that shift, something subtle happens. The more comfortable you become with solitude, the more clearly human behavior reveals itself. Not in a harsh or judgmental way, but in a more detached and observant way. You start noticing that many interactions are not purely emotional. They are shaped by underlying needs, validation, attention, security, and sometimes a quiet avoidance of one's own inner emptiness. From that perspective, even ordinary conversations can start to feel different. there is often an unseen layer beneath them, small psychological exchanges happening in real time. Who is seeking approval? Who is trying to maintain control of perception? Who is avoiding rejection? Who is quietly carrying resentment behind politeness? Most people never register this layer because they rarely sit long enough in silence to observe it. The longer distance becomes part of your experience, the more unfamiliar the world can start to feel, not because people have changed, but because perception has. Modern life, in many ways, keeps the mind continuously occupied. Constant messages, constant updates, constant interaction, leaving very little space for inner observation. And without that space, it becomes easy to stay focused outward indefinitely. Most people learn to suppress these parts early, labeling them as unacceptable or unproductive. But suppression does not remove them. It only pushes them deeper, where they continue to influence thoughts and behavior in indirect ways. That is why, over time, some people can become overwhelmed without clear reason, or emotionally numb without understanding when it began. When the internal self is ignored for too long, eventually it finds other ways to surface. And silence often becomes the space where this hidden material finally becomes noticeable. This is also where distance can start to feel uncomfortable, not because something external is missing, but because there is no longer anything distracting enough to avoid what is internal. No constant interaction, no continuous validation, no background noise to soften self-reflection. And in that stillness, a person begins to see more clearly how much of their behavior was shaped by fear of rejection, how many relationships were maintained through guilt or obligation, and how often kindness was used as a way to avoid conflict rather than an expression of genuine alignment. That realization can be difficult because it challenges the assumption that the self is fixed and fully authentic. In reality, much of what people call personality is shaped through repetition, adaptation, and survival within social environments. Over time, these adaptations become so familiar that they feel like identity itself. But once that becomes visible, social interaction changes in a quiet way. You begin to notice patterns more easily, subtle attempts at reassurance, unspoken expectations, emotional cues hidden within casual language. Not necessarily because people are intentionally manipulating, but because most communication carries unconscious needs underneath it. And when you see that clearly, it becomes harder to experience interaction in the same automatic way as before. The need for validation, the quiet desire to be seen as important, the subtle resentment toward those who ignored you, even the satisfaction that comes from being missed after you step away, none of it points to moral failure. It points to being human. And this is where the meaning of isolation is often misunderstood. Isolation is not about rising above others. It is about seeing yourself without distortion for the first time. That process is rarely comfortable because the ego depends on carefully maintained illusions to feel stable. In silence, those illusions begin to weaken, and with them, certain uncomfortable realizations start to surface. You begin to understand why so many people constantly surround themselves with noise, whether through relationships, entertainment, endless scrolling, substances, or constant interaction. Not always because they are unaware, but because stopping might mean encountering themselves without distraction. Many people are not simply addicted to social media, they are addicted to avoiding themselves. And once that becomes clear, perception shifts in a lasting way. After enough time alone, the need for explanation starts to fade. The urge to defend yourself weakens. The desire to be understood by everyone loses urgency. Even approval begins to feel less emotionally powerful than before. Not because emotion disappears, but because perception becomes clearer. You start recognizing how unstable human perception actually is. People rarely see you directly. They interpret you through their own fears, expectations, insecurities, and unresolved experiences. The same silence can be interpreted as confidence by one person, detachment by another, and rejection by someone else. and when that becomes obvious, a shift happens internally. Less energy is spent trying to control perception because it becomes clear that perception was never fully controllable in the first place. Jung believed that until unconscious patterns are made conscious, they continue to shape a person's life in ways that feel like fate. In reality, they are repetitions, emotional loops, behavioral habits, attachment dynamics played out over and over without awareness. Isolation brings those patterns into focus, especially the ones tied to attachment. When someone withdraws, even temporarily, something begins to surface, not only in others, but within the self. The impulse to check, to reach out, to see who noticed, to imagine reactions that may not even exist. And in that moment, something important becomes visible. Constant communication is not always connection. Sometimes it is regulation, a way of soothing uncertainty, filling silence, maintaining emotional stimulation. Notifications become reassurance. Replies become proof of significance. Attention becomes a form of psychological grounding. When that is removed, discomfort appears not necessarily because connection is lost, but because distraction is gone. And without distraction, awareness becomes unavoidable. In silence, there is no performance to maintain and no external feedback to lean on. Only thought, observation, and self-contact. That is why solitude feels threatening for many people. Not because it is empty, but because it is honest. It removes the systems that normally soften self-perception. And what remains is often a more direct view of internal life than many are used to facing. From that perspective, social interaction begins to look less like instinct and more like structure. People managing impressions, protecting insecurities, constructing identities that feel stable enough to present to others. Some do it through humor, some through intelligence, some through dominance, success, appearance, or constant connection. The forms differ, but the underlying effort is often the same. And this is the part isolation makes difficult to ignore. That much of what is presented socially is not deception in a deliberate sense, but adaptation. And adaptation always carries a cost. For some, it is authenticity. For others, it is peace. For many, it is a slow loss of self-awareness. The most unsettling realization is not that people are fake, but that most are performing without fully realizing it. So deeply adapted to external feedback that being alone begins to feel emotionally unsafe. Not everyone will understand that shift. Some may interpret it as change, detachment, or withdrawal. But often, it is simply a return to internal clarity. And in that clarity, one understanding becomes difficult to unsee. If you never step out of the noise, you may spend your entire life mistaking who you are for who you were rewarded for being. Eventually, you return, but not in any noticeable or dramatic way. Most people won't register the exact moment it happens. The shift is internal, subtle, almost untraceable from the outside. But you feel it clearly, because something within you no longer reacts to life in the same automatic way. The old urgency around constant connection begins to fade. You stop needing immediate replies. You stop feeling emotionally responsible for maintaining every bond. And slowly, you start understanding a distinction that most people never truly separate: loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the discomfort of feeling unseen. Solitude is the calm that comes from finally seeing yourself without interference. Many people never reach that distinction because silence feels threatening to them. Silence removes the external feedback that helps them define who they are. Without that feedback, identity can feel unstable, even unfamiliar. This is also why absence affects people more than they expect. Not necessarily because absence is painful in itself, but because it interrupts emotional dependency. When access to someone disappears, the structure built around that access begins to reveal itself. Some people fade quietly, especially those who were only connected through need or convenience. Others remain without pressure or demands, and that difference becomes difficult to ignore. Over time, relationships stop appearing equal in the same way they once did, not from bitterness, but from clarity. You begin to notice that some connections are built on genuine care, while others are sustained through emotional utility. Some people are attached to presence, not personhood. What they miss is not always you, but the emotional experience your availability created for them. And that realization reshapes how connection is understood. It becomes harder to romanticize every interaction. It becomes clearer that some people value attention more than intimacy, and others value control more than mutual understanding. There are also those who only feel emotionally grounded when they are needed, not when they are simply connected. From this perspective, even expressions like "I miss you" can carry multiple layers. Sometimes it reflects genuine emotional presence. Other times it reflects a longing for access, for familiarity, for the comfort of predictability. And as those layers fall away, discomfort often follows. Not everyone responds positively to change, especially when the change reduces predictability. Some people are comfortable with you only within familiar boundaries. When those boundaries shift, tension appears, because predictability is tied closely to emotional control. Silence, in particular, disrupts that control. It removes immediate access, and in doing so, it removes the ability to interpret or influence your reactions in real time. That is why silence can feel more unsettling to some than confrontation. Confrontation still maintains engagement. Silence creates distance without negotiation. With enough solitude, another layer of awareness begins to surface. You start noticing how much of what people think, want, and express is shaped by their environment. Opinions are often inherited. Desires are often socially reinforced. Even personality traits can be refined through repetition and external reinforcement rather than pure self-origin. This realization shifts perception significantly. Distance reduces social influence. It weakens automatic acceptance of shared beliefs and behaviors. And slowly, questions begin to form that are difficult to ignore, whether certain relationships are truly chosen or simply maintained out of habit, whether personal beliefs are genuinely formed or absorbed over time, whether daily life reflects authentic preference or socially reinforced performance. These questions are not comfortable because they interrupt unconscious living. And once awareness reaches that point, returning fully to unexamined patterns becomes increasingly difficult. That's the real reason disappearance changes people. Not because isolation magically transforms them, but because silence removes everything that was covering the truth. And when that covering disappears, what you see can permanently change how you understand human nature. A lot of people are not actually searching for truth, connection, or authenticity. They are searching for comfort, even when that comfort slowly distances them from who they really are. Eventually, you return, but not in any obvious way. There is no dramatic shift that others can point to. The change is internal, subtle, almost invisible from the outside. But you feel it clearly, because something in you stops reacting the same way it used to. The old urgency around constant connection begins to fade. You stop needing immediate replies. You stop feeling responsible for holding every relationship together. And for the first time, you begin to understand the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the pain of feeling unseen. Solitude is the calm of finally seeing yourself clearly. Most people never reach that distinction. They stay afraid of silence because silence removes the external feedback they use to define their identity. Without constant interaction, they no longer know who they are. That's why disappearance unsettles people. Not because absence is cruel, but because it interrupts emotional dependency. When access disappears, reality starts to surface. The people who only reached out when they needed something slowly fade. The ones who were attached to convenience disappear with the convenience. And the ones who truly valued you remain without pressure, without constant proof, without conditions. And that changes something in you. You become more selective, not out of ego, but out of awareness. Because once you see how many interactions are built on unconscious emotional exchange, you stop romanticizing connections so easily. You begin to realize something uncomfortable. Some people don't love intimacy, they love attention. Some don't want connection, they want control. And many people who say they miss you are really missing how they felt when you were available. Because becoming yourself often requires letting go of versions of you that were built to keep others comfortable. The agreeable version, the endlessly available version, the version that avoids disappointing anyone. And not everyone adapts well to the version that comes after. Some people only connect with the parts of you they can predict. And when they can no longer predict your reactions, your emotions, or your availability, something shifts. Control weakens. And unpredictability creates discomfort. That's why silence can disturb people more than confrontation. Confrontation still gives access. Silence removes it completely without explanation, and the mind struggles most with what it cannot reach or influence. With enough solitude, another layer of awareness begins to form. You start noticing how much of what people believe, want, and even express is shaped by their environment. Ideas are absorbed, behaviors are copied. Even identity is often built through repetition rather than reflection. Distance weakens that influence. And slowly, questions start to appear that most people avoid. Do I actually enjoy these relationships, or have I just maintained them out of habit? Do I believe this, or did I inherit it from the people around me? Am I living authentically, or performing a version of myself that fits in? These questions are not dangerous because they are wrong. They are dangerous because once they are seen clearly, they cannot be unseen. And that's the real reason disappearance changes people. Not because isolation transforms them into someone new, but because silence finally reveals what noise was protecting them from seeing all along. And once you see it clearly, you don't really go back to the same version of life again. If you've ever felt the need to step away from everything just to hear your own thoughts again, you already understand more than you think. If you found this valuable, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear this, and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.